So the topic that I've chosen to focus on is the Malthusian theory and how it relates to the bee population. So what is the Malthusian theory? The Malthusian theory is a scenario where the population outgrows the agricultural production and there's not the ability to produce enough food for the global population. It was first brought up by Thomas Malthusian in 1798, and then there was a rebirth of the idea in an environmental aspect in regards to World War One, and then during World War Two and after World War Two, as resources really become globalized. So in this time, there was also the works of eugenics, and people also started to genetically modify organisms and create alternatives to natural substances like we see below with the manure and replacing it with this fertilizer. So the United States had an issue with being perceived as gluttonous by the rest of the world, and we see this in a depiction of this art, as we see here the American food supply interrelaced with world famine. This is shown in this piece of artwork called The Most Critical Race in History, and it was done in 1917 and described to show the connection between World War I related famine and the American agricultural industry. So we see kind of the issue with America's gluttonous habits and how that relates globally to what's going on. So in the 20th century, there was a lot of change brought on. People switched from using horses to using tractors and going from using manure to using chemical fertilizers that we saw before in the picture, and we didn't know that that was going to highly impact our pollinators such as bees, which would then in turn further harm our crops and damage them even more because there weren't as many pollinators to help out with the crops. So another thing that people started doing is they started applying pesticides with planes where they would fly over large amounts of space, spraying these pesticides. So now it was also airborne and falling upon things that were in the way of these pesticides being sprayed from planes. So in regards to the population going up as food production is going kind of down, there was also the lack of infant death. The infant death rate went down as our medical fields got more well practiced. And so we also see then the baby boomers being born and then the exponential growth that is linked off of that, and how our population, our world population, kind of really spikes up off of the baby boomers. And so we see also this increase of urbanization and globalization in our resources. So how do bees play a large role? So the bees play a large role in our farming industry, and our farming industry gives us our produce. So if our bees are suffering, our produce is suffering. If our produce is suffering, then we're not getting the food that we need. So there are certain plants that are only pollinated by bees. So there's an immediate threat to bees going extinct or not being available to pollinate in certain areas. So a very large amount of agricultural crops are 90 to 100% reliant on the honeybee pollination, And those include things like almonds, apples, avocados, blueberries, cranberries, cherries, kiwi, macadamia nuts, asparagus, broccoli, carrots, cauliflower, celery, cucumber, onion, legumes, pumpkin, squash, sunflowers. And then there's also more food that is reliant on bees, just to a lesser amount, but still pretty reliant. And those foods include apricots, oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruits, tangerines, peaches, pears, nectarines, plums, grapes, strawberries, olives, melons, honeydew, cantaloupe, watermelon, peanuts, cotton, soybeans, and sugar beets. So there's a great deal of produce that is reliant on the honeybee population. And not only are those products reliant on the honeybee population, but we also have our meat industry where some of the animals are reliant on food sources that are also pollinated by bees. So, bees also maintain this certain landscape and ecosystem, playing a very important role into the food chain. So while there are other pollinators, such as hummingbirds and other insects, bees do make up 80% of the world's population. So it's a very significant contribution that the bees play in our pollination worldwide. So we kind of continue to enable the destruction to this day by continuing to use pesticides. We're not dealing with the residual effects of pesticides, and when we use these pesticides, not only is it causing the death of bees that come into contact with it, but that takes away from the bigger hive, and there aren't as many food resources reserved for the winter time because these bees are dying off. So the bees that are left alive from the consequences of the pesticides are still being harmed when they don't have enough food now to make it through the winter because there weren't enough bees there to collect. So bees can also be killed in flight. So as I said, with people spraying stuff from planes and just spraying things like on their gardens, bees can be killed by that contact in flight. And also by the water absorbed that they drink that has been absorbed with pesticides. And they can also spread pesticides by bringing food that has been, like food sources that have been contaminated by pesticides into the hive, which then inflict the other bees that come in contact with that food all throughout the hive. So, since pollen consumption needs at least a week of fermentation, that right there puts the detrimental side effects of pesticides already a week out, harming much more bees than the one that brought it in. And then the consumption of the pollen can be delayed as much as 8 months. So we're looking now at 8 months of bees being harmed by these pesticides. And as we see in some of the labeling, there's a misleading level of toxicity. So we have to look at both the individual and the hive. So although one bee may not be affected and be inflicted in death because of a low toxicity pesticide, it may bring it into the hive where there are not full-grown bees, and they will easily be killed by these low levels of toxicity. It also doesn't account for exposure over time, so even though it may be a low level of toxicity, exposure over time does a great deal of damage. So, Another issue is the short-term trade-off of farmers where they're killing off the wild bees while using pesticides because they get rid of any other pests, and then their produce as well, and then they kill off the wild bees, and then they just use commercial bees to pollinate their produce. And while they may benefit from their produce being pollinated by commercial bees now, it's only proportional to the current cost. So just because it's affordable now doesn't mean it will be later, and I'll go into that more in the following slides that have to do with the financial repercussions of pesticides. So some of the extinction patterns that we're already seeing and some projected ones include in tropical areas dominated by figs. If figs were to cease to exist, then 80% of vertebrae that are dependent on those figs would then cease to exist in these areas. And then, as we see in oceanic islands with depauperate entomophilous fauna, that's another risk, because if one pollinator were to decrease or disappear, it would make significant loss of biodiversity. And an example we see here on the right is with the flying fox in the Southwest Pacific, which would lead to linked extinctions in the island communities. So pesticides lead to lack of blueberries, affecting birds and bears and human beings. So another issue is with birds, spiders, lizards, and other predators who rely on pollinators as their food are also at risk, since that's their prey. So as for the financial repercussions of famine, we see examples from the 70s where the blueberry crop suffered, causing a multi-million-dollar loss in New Brunswick. And then again in 97 where the cherry prices rose for the same reason, and in 98 pumpkins. So the bee's commercial monetary value is already $15 billion annually in the US, and then as of 2019 there's an estimated $235 to $285 billion contribution of bees. So as I had said earlier, prices for colonies are rising, and so in the late 90s, a hive was $35, and a colony was $35, and then in 2005, a colony was $75, and then in 2009, the price rose to $150 a colony. So because of fewer honeybees, the price is increasing, yet they kill off more wild bees because it's cost efficient short term. But as we see, the cost of hives is not a constant. So while farmers are driving away hives now, the cost won't be beneficial or manageable later. And this is really what brings in the threats of famine, because while it's cost efficient now, it won't be in the future. So eventually, the cost of buying hives will surpass the cost of profit made by selling these produce. So we're looking at first the initial threat of the financial repercussions, which would ultimately lead to the demise of human civilization, and then we would have to deal with the very real threats of these produce being really obsolete. And that's when we see our real apocalyptic situation. So what we can do to prevent this is instill education programs for park managers, farm managers, and educational farms. We can hold pesticide companies accountable and start off with transparent warning labels, and we can just ban pesticides. We can stop spraying weeds like dandelions and stop spraying plants you grow. That's something you can do yourself. And we can initiate highway patrol with the same thing of managing weeds and flowers and things on the sides of the roads that bees use, because dandelions are one of their first resources they go to for pollination.